Video games have changed in many significant ways over their 30 plus years of existence. At first glance, someone might say that the only change has been the amount of pixels, colours or sounds that a game can handle, or the form of media that they are distributed on, i.e. cartridges, discs or download, but this is far from the case. The video game industry is much more complicated than it first may seem, and there have been a significant amount of changes that have shaped it to what it is today. This video will take you through the entire history of video games, give you an insight into what the industry was like and the major changes, improvements and turning points in video game history. So let's take a look at what video games were before video games, or in better words, what influenced the creation of video games. The two forms of entertainment that most resembled video games before video games were pinball tables and board games. Pinball tables were introduced as early as the late 1700s with the invention of the spring launcher. However, it was not until the 1930s or 40s when electrification, active bumpers and flippers were introduced. This became the contemporary basis of what was considered a pinball table. The aim of pinball is to use your hands to activate the flippers at the bottom of a pinball table to keep a ball in play and to earn points to carry on for as long as possible. This stimulates the same sense of enjoyment in the player as early video games did, where the main aim would be to earn high scores. Board games also share similarities to video games in terms of multiplayer. Board games are played by using a number of pieces on a board in different ways, but generally involve the same objectives to beat the opponent. These include having more points than your opponent, e.g. Scrabble, winning position, e.g. snakes and ladders, and ridding the player of their pieces, e.g. chess. Like pinball, board games are a type of game presented and played in a different way, but still stimulate a similar sense of enjoyment to the player as video games. Later board games, such as 1974's Dungeons & Dragons and other role-playing board games, try to emulate a feeling of going on an adventure to the player, similar to role-playing video games introducing the third generation of video games. A big debate is what is considered the first ever video game of all time. The earliest electronic game was known as the cathode ray tube amusement device. It was a missile simulator inspired by radar displays during World War II. However, at this time graphics were not even possible and it used screen overlays as targets. Therefore, there isn't any video in this video game and it can't really be considered a video game. A much more likely candidate for the first video game is 1959's Tennis for Two. This game used an oscilloscope in order to project the vector graphics to the player. The game has no objective but involves the player hitting a tennis ball over a net. The player used a button to hit the ball and a knob to alter trajectory. This could be considered the first ever video game because it actually involves an image being powered electrically and input from the player is required. However, the game has no objectives and presents the player with no sense of progression or achievement and therefore lacks fundamental attributes of video games. The first video game to introduce this was Space War. It was created by Steve Russell only 3 years after Tennis for Two. This game included two players controlling spaceships trying to shoot down enemy spaceships. This game could be considered the first true video game as it involved all of the core elements of video games and was also the first multiplayer game as well as the first game of the shooter genre. The first generation of games began in 1972 with the Magnavox Odyssey. The Magnavox Odyssey was the first games console of all time and was created by Bill Rush and Ralph Baer. Their vision began in 1951 while Ralph Baer was constructing a television from scratch. He wanted to focus on somehow creating an interactive television and carried on work on it until 1966. Baer created a simple two-player video game that could be displayed on a standard television set called Chase, where two dots chased each other around the screen. Bill Rush was appointed to the project in order to speed up the process. A third machine-controlled dot was used to create a ping-pong style game, which is most commonly referred to as Pong. Further funding was pushed to this project in order to create more games. Originally, Magnavox were trying to partner with TV companies in order to distribute the games on the television set and use a switchboard to switch between games, something that they named Brown Box. However, during the 1960s and 1970s, the cable television industry wasn't doing well, and a lack of funding meant Magnavox had to change their approach. They made alterations to Brown Box. Games were now stored onto a type of removable printed circuit board that inserts into a slot similar to a cartridge slot, which was introduced later. Also, to reduce manufacturing costs, they opted to use black and white graphics rather than colour graphics, but included coloured overlays which are placed over the TV to give the screen a colour tint. After all these alterations, the Magnavox Odyssey was released into the public as the first video game system of all time. One of the main turning points that the Magnavox Odyssey presented to the gaming industry was interchangeable cartridges. However, the data for the game was not actually stored on the cartridges themselves, but on the console. The cartridges were merely coded to start a specific game on the console. The Magnavox Odyssey was not released to much success due to poor marketing. However, other companies saw the potential in video games and decided to make video games of their own, but most of these were just clones of Pong. The most successful of these being Atari Sears Telegames Pong and Coleco Telstar. These gained more success in the Magnavox Odyssey, and soon many more companies created their own Pong clones, including big toy and television companies such as Philips, Commodore, Mattel and Nintendo. This led to many lawsuits between Magnavox and other companies, all ending in favour of Magnavox. The second generation is a very important generation in the history of video games for many reasons. The second generation saw a huge rise and fall in popularity in video games, mainly in the United States. Due to technological advances and developers becoming more familiar with creating games, more original games could be created which branched into new genres, which is a big difference from the first generation where a video game was typically a Pong clone. The first video game console released in the second generation was the Fairchild Channel F in 1976. It introduced a few things into the industry, the main one being actual game cartridges. Each game cartridge sold separately housed one or several games each and became a staple in the video game industry, where all big game consoles afterwards had cartridges or another form of interchangeable media. It also introduced computer-controlled opponents, often referred to as AI. Prior to this, opponents could only be controlled by human players. The most popular console of this generation was the Atari 2600, first known as the Atari VCS. The Atari 2600 was the first mainstream home video game system and sold 30 million units. Atari really pushed the Atari 2600 and flooded America with advertisements to try and get as many Atari 2600s into as many homes as possible. It became so popular that the name Atari became the associated word with the video games. The Atari housed a multitude of popular games such as Asteroids, Space Invaders, and Combat. This was also when the term joystick was coined because of the Atari 2600's controller. It included a single button and a vertical stick used for movement and other things. After the growth in popularity of the console, it became the first console to acquire third-party support. A wide range of developers began developing for the Atari 2600, one of the most famous being Activision, who made some of the best games for Atari 2600, including Pitfall, and the first ever action-adventure game, Adventure. However, after the rise in popularity of video games, it declined until a large crash in the video game industry, known as the video game crash of 1983. There are many factors that led to this crash. Firstly, due to the success of the Atari 2600, other companies also tried to create video game systems. Some of these systems gained a slight amount of success, such as the Magnavox Odyssey 2, Mattel Intellivision and ColecoVision. However, other systems did not gain as much success, and the complete oversaturation of game consoles confused consumers, and they didn't know which consoles to buy, as each had a separate library of games. Even Atari were trying to push their new console, the Atari 5200, while still supporting the Atari 2600. One of the main reasons for the crash was the plethora of bad games released by Atari, the main culprits being Pac-Man and E.T. Extraterrestrial on Atari 2600. Pac-Man was one of the most successful arcade games of that time, and Atari was severely advertising it in attempts to make the home version of Pac-Man sell Atari 2600s. In fact, they were so confident that this game would sell systems that they created more cartridges of Pac-Man than the amount of Atari 2600 units sold at the time. It did end up being the best-selling game on the Atari 2600, selling over 7 million copies. However, the game was so bad that the consumers complained and became very angry that it was so far off from the arcade version. E.T. Extraterrestrial was another story of false promises. It was advertised as a close adaptation of the very popular Steven Spielberg film. However, it was far from it. The development team were only given 5 weeks to make the game in order to get it out for Christmas 1982. The game was so bad that it is often classed as the worst video game of all time and was a commercial failure. One advancement in the video game industry during this generation was Milton Bradley's Microvision. It was the first handheld system and it included interchangeable cartridges to boot. After the North American video game crash of 1983, video game development shifted more towards Japan. A company called Nintendo tried their hand at making a video game console and marketed it more towards an Eastern audience. They created the Famicom, which became one of the greatest selling video game systems of all time. In order to sell the Famicom in North America, they were unable to label it as a video game system as stores were unlikely to stock them due to the lack of interest created by the video game crash. To get around this, they cunningly bundled the video game system in with a peripheral called Rob the Robot and marketed it as a robot system rather than a video game system, and called it the Nintendo Entertainment System, oftenly referred to as NES. The NES received much more success and was later advertised as a video game system and bundled with Super Mario Bros., one of the best-selling games of all time, which sold over 40 million units, which drew more success. Japanese development was clearly embraced worldwide, seeing as the NES outsold Atari's Atari 7800 17-1. One of the biggest changes was that the Famicom could handle screen-scrolling graphics opposed to just static screens. This gave birth to one of the most popular genres, especially during this generation, the platformer. The general idea of most platformers is to traverse from the left side of a side-scrolling screen to the right while jumping or shooting to avoid obstacles and enemies. There was an abundance of platformers during this generation. Some of the most popular include Super Mario Bros., Mega Man, Contra, and several others. The NES also popularized the traditional controller. Rather than a joystick, it featured a 4-way directional pad, 2 face buttons, and a start and select button. This became the standard for controllers and has only been improved since. Controllers rarely used joysticks after this was introduced. Not only was this generation the introduction to Nintendo, but it was also the introduction to Sega. In 1985 they released the Sega Master System. In terms of capabilities, it was generally on par with the NES. However, its success in certain regions of the world led to the beginning of what was known as the console wars. Another change during this generation was that games began to tell stories. This mainly occurred in adventure games or RPGs and helped form these two genres. Some examples of games that were heavily focused on stories are The Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and Phantasy Star. Some of these games focused heavily on using in-game text in order to tell and expand these stories. Another improvement was the ability to save game data to the cartridge. Since games were becoming much lengthier, some taking several hours to complete, one sitting was not enough to complete some games, and so the ability to save game data was introduced, so that players could resume from where they last left off. Again, this feature was mostly used in adventure games and RPGs. In the fourth generation of video games, a new era started known as the Bit Wars. This was first started because of NEC's new console, the TurboGrafx-16, known in Japan as the PC Engine. It was the first 16-bit console released on the market, while both Nintendo and Sega only had 8-bit consoles, the NES and the Sega Master System, although this was really just a marketing strategy. However, one game in particular on the TurboGrafx-16 changed the video game industry, Splatterhouse. This was one of the first violent games released and caused a lot of controversy. In 1988, Sega released the Sega Mega Drive, known in the United States as the Sega Genesis. Although this wasn't released to a major success, it became much more popular in 1991 with the release of the game Sonic the Hedgehog. This game really showed off one of the Sega Mega Drive's unique and most marketable features, blast processing, which allowed games to run at a higher speed than other consoles and was shown off best in Sonic the Hedgehog. The Sega Mega Drive also housed more arcade games than other consoles. Nintendo released a successor to their popular Nintendo Entertainment System in the form of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, known as the Super Famicom in Japan. For the first time in video game history, two systems had almost an equal share of the market, and this was the first time that the term console wars could be used properly. Both Sega and Nintendo had to work harder in showing the differences in the consoles, and how one is better than the other. For the most part, the SNES had better graphics than the Sega Mega Drive, and had something that they called Mode 7. Mode 7 was a type of 3D mode that was used in some games on the SNES, most notably in F-Zero and Final Fantasy VI. The main improvements that were seen during this generation were in visual and audio quality. Some games managed to include sprites rendered using CG. Most notable for this was Donkey Kong Country. Also, a lot of genres were introduced or made popular during this generation. One in particular was the fighting genre. Two of the most popular fighting games had their most popular games during this generation, Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter 2. As well as console wars during this generation, there were also rivalries between franchises in certain genres, one of the most famous being Mortal Kombat vs Street Fighter 2. Another example being Sonic the Hedgehog vs Super Mario World in the platforming genre. The first-person shooter genre was also introduced during this generation. Generally, video games weren't aimed at a mature audience, but this has particularly been pushed during this generation, with games such as Splatterhouse, Mortal Kombat and Doom. One thing about these games that particularly makes them violent is the inclusion of blood. During this time that was especially frowned upon, since video games were generally aimed at a younger audience. Nintendo particularly stressed this by getting the blood removed from the SNES version of Mortal Kombat, whereas it remained in the Sega Mega Drive version. One thing introduced in this generation which wasn't much of a success was the mini-games using full motion video. Sega released the Sega Mega CD and Sega 32X as add-ons for the Sega Mega Drive. The Sega Mega CD could run games on a CD format, which allowed games to have more data and to have much higher sound and graphics quality compared to cartridges. The Sega 32X meant that games could have a higher graphical quality and was another way for Sega to best the competition in the bit war. However, neither of these add-ons were very popular. Philips created their own CD-based console, the Philips CDI. The CDI, Sega Mega CD and Sega 32X had a lot of games that used full motion video, which was recorded video using live actors. Most of these games weren't very good and received poor sales and poor reviews. Some examples of games that did this are Night Trap, Make My Video Marky Mark, and Slam City with Scotty Pippen. One of the biggest things during this generation was the huge success of handheld gaming thanks to the Nintendo Game Boy. It was released in 1989 and has sold over 110 million units. It could only be played in black and white, but had similar power and capabilities to the NES. One of the main reasons for its success was the pack-in title Tetris. Tetris is one of the best-selling games of all time and is regarded as one of the best games of all time. As well as this, it launched with Super Mario Land, which was also very popular. Other handheld consoles were released during this generation, but didn't have anywhere near the success that the Nintendo Game Boy had, and didn't really stand out much, apart from the Sega Game Gear, which was the first handheld console which played in colour. What could be considered the biggest turning point throughout the history of video games occurred in this generation, the leap into the third dimension. Prior to this, video games were predominantly only able to be created in 2D. 3D games saw an increased use of polygons, whereas games predominantly used pixels. The first console that was released with these fully functional 3D capabilities was the Sega Saturn in November 22nd, 1994 in Japan, and along with the Sega 32X was considered one of Sega's biggest failures due to several reasons. Firstly, it was released merely 6 months after the Sega 32X. Consumers were confused at the actual point of the console and how it differentiated from the Sega 32X. Arguably, one of the main reasons for the Sega Mega Drive's success was Sonic the Hedgehog, and the Sega Saturn did not release with a Sonic title. In fact, the planned 3D Sonic title Sonic Extreme was cancelled. Despite the Sega Saturn's commercial failure, it actually had merits that made it a valid competitor to the Sony PlayStation. The Sega Saturn could handle much better versions of 2D games. However, the general consensus was that 3D was the way forward, and therefore, this didn't help sell the Sega Saturn. The Sony PlayStation was one of the most successful consoles of all time and sold over 102 million units, making it the 4th best-selling games console of all time. One of the biggest advantages that the Sony PlayStation had over the Nintendo 64, which was its main competitor, was the format that the games were stored on. Due to the increasing complexity of games in terms of amount of content, graphics and sound, storage on cartridges was being pushed to their limit. CDs could handle over 650 megabytes worth of data, compared to the Nintendo 64 cartridges which could only handle 64 megabytes of data. This made the PlayStation a much more desirable platform to develop for, and in which case Nintendo lost many exclusive franchises to Sony such as Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Mega Man and Castlevania. In fact, Square and Enix were initially developing Final Fantasy VII and Dragon Quest VII respectively for Nintendo 64. However, due to the quality of these games and the extreme length of these games, Dragon Quest VII being more than 100 hours in length, they required much more memory to make than the Nintendo 64 could offer, and in such case had to switch to design for PlayStation. The largest games on SNES were Tales of Fantasia and Star Ocean, which were 48 megabytes. This pales in comparison to games of this generation which were exceeding 2 gigabytes, which is over 2,000 megabytes. Despite the qualities that CDs had to offer, they also had some drawbacks. One big problem was that it made piracy much easier. Due to the growing popularity of CD burners, it was much easier to copy a PlayStation game than it was to copy any cartridge-based games. This was when illegal piracy became a big issue in the video game industry and has been a big problem ever since. The PlayStation had many games that clearly showed off the capabilities of video games and in some ways changed how games were made. Many PlayStation games presented things that were first for the industry. For example, Final Fantasy VII was the first game to introduce full pre-rendered 3D CG cutscenes, and for the time it was visually stunning and impressed gamers and critics everywhere. Let's take a look. In 1997, that was impressive. Another game that received critical acclaim and was one of the first for its time was Metal Gear Solid on the Sony PlayStation. The game had a huge impact on the industry as it was a video game that very closely resembled a movie. This game included some of the most realistic looking characters that could be achieved at the time and used a full cast of exceptional voice actors. Previously, it would tend to only be games of the RPG genre that truly focused on storyline. However, Metal Gear Solid, an action game, focused heavily on the narrative and delivered a very story-driven experience that was filled with believable characters, thousands of lines of dialogue, and exciting plot twists.
What's the situation, Snake?
Looks like the elevator in the back is the only way up.
Just as I expected. You'll have to take the elevator to the surface, but make sure nobody sees you.
The game very resembled an action movie, which no games at the time even attempted. After this, it wasn't just RPGs and adventure games that attempted to add in a story, but most genres began to do it. The third main console of this generation was the Nintendo 64. It was released in June 1996, and despite a few format flaws, it was superior to the Sony PlayStation in a number of ways. The main advantage that the Nintendo 64 had over the Sony PlayStation was the uniqueness of the graphics processor. The Nintendo 64's graphics chip was capable of trilinear filtering, unlike the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. Trilinear filtering meant that textures could look smooth, unlike the Saturn and PlayStation, where games looked much more pixelated. Therefore, generally Nintendo 64 games had better graphics. Strong examples of this are The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, Banjo-Kazooie, and Perfect Dark. The Nintendo 64 was much better to produce 3D games for. However, the downside of this was that it was much harder to produce 2D games for. Almost all the Nintendo 64 games used polygonal objects as opposed to pixelated sprites, which were often used in Saturn and PlayStation games. That is why big selling games like Castlevania Symphony of the Night were not also created for the Nintendo 64. The only 2D games that appeared on Nintendo 64 that worked well were the ones that used 3D backgrounds, such as Kirby 64. The Nintendo 64 also introduced many things into the gaming industry that still stand today. The analog stick, although first introduced on the Sega Saturn's 3D controller, was popularized on the Nintendo 64's controller. Also, the Nintendo 64 popularized the Rumble Pack, which was bundled with copies of Lilac Wars. This provided the controller with vibration. Another thing that the Nintendo 64 achieved was popularizing the first-person shooter genre, particularly the multiplayer aspect. The main game that did this was Rare's GoldenEye 007. In terms of handheld innovation, Nintendo released what was one of the biggest failures in the video game industry, the Virtual Boy. It was released in 1995 when the idea of virtual reality and 3D technology was the latest craze. Nintendo tried to capitalize on this idea and released the Virtual Boy. It used a combination of a pair of screens and mirrors to project an image that appeared to be proceeding towards the player. This was a first for the video game industry as it was the first console to fully embrace 3D. Despite this, it failed for many reasons. The 24-bit 3D red graphics were not appealing, and many players claimed that it gave them headaches after just 30 minutes of play. Sega kickstarted the 6th generation quite early with the 1998 release of the Sega Dreamcast. Sega hoped that the Sega Dreamcast would restore Sega's reputation, which had been damaged by the Sega Saturn, 32X and Mega CD. With early games such as Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur and The House of the Dead 2, it was clear that the 3D graphics were superior to the Nintendo 64. However, there was not much hype created for the Dreamcast because most people were waiting for the PlayStation 2, which was said to be released in 2000. Consequently, the Dreamcast sold poorly and was discontinued in 2002. One of the biggest contributions the Dreamcast introduced was online play with other people using an internet connection. Although it was not greatly popular, games like Phantasy Star Online and Bomberman Online showed the potential of online play, which later became a huge success. After the Dreamcast, Sega began developing for other consoles. One of the biggest shocks of the time was when Sonic Adventure 2 Battle was released on the Nintendo GameCube. In 2000, Sony released what is currently the best-selling console of all time, the Sony PlayStation 2. It sold over 154 million units. One of the biggest contributing factors to the PlayStation 2's success was that its proprietary media was CD-ROMs and DVD-ROMs. DVDs were significantly larger than CDs and could store much more data, allowing for even larger games. However, I don't believe that the allowance for larger games is what sold the console to consumers. The PlayStation 2 could also play movies stored on DVDs and music CDs. Therefore, it was a multimedia or multi-purpose machine. People would no longer have to buy 3 systems in order to watch films, play games and listen to music. This was a major selling point for the PlayStation 2 and is one of the main reasons I believe it sold as well as it did. After this, almost every system released was a multimedia system or built even more on the concept. The graphics of the PlayStation 2 were also far superior to the Dreamcast and showed that games could look even more realistic. One game in particular that shows this is Metal Gear Solid 3. This generation saw the introduction of a massive computer company into the world of video games. Microsoft released the Xbox. Whereas Sega's consoles hardware is modelled towards arcade boards, Microsoft's consoles are modelled towards PCs, which is why some games like Splinter Cell and Max Payne can achieve better graphics on Xbox compared to PlayStation 2. Microsoft's biggest success was the launch game Halo, which some may argue is the sole reason that the Xbox was successful. It reintroduced the first-person genre to consoles and followed the legacy of games such as GoldenEye before it. Like GoldenEye, Halo included a multiplayer mode which saw much success and can also be considered the sole reason that LAN parties became popular. A year after the Xbox was released, Microsoft released Xbox Live, which was an online service for the Xbox. Like the Dreamcast, it allowed players to connect their consoles online using an internet connection and play against people around the world. This service gained great popularity compared to Sega's online service, which could be due to a few reasons. Firstly, the Xbox simply had better games that were more popular, such as Unreal Championship and Halo 2. Secondly, Xbox Live offered more social aspects such as a friends list and voice chat. Shortly after the Xbox was released, Nintendo released the Nintendo GameCube. The Nintendo GameCube was very similar to the PlayStation 2 and Xbox and didn't offer many contributions to the video game industry. However, one that was introduced later after its launch was the wireless controllers in the form of the Wavebird wireless controller. It used radio frequencies and it could reach up to 20 feet away from the console. Not much happened in terms of handheld gaming during this generation. Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance, which was very popular and was essentially a portable SNES with slightly better capabilities. However, one thing to note during this generation was Nokia's N-Gage. It was a phone that was also a full-fledged handheld gaming system. It wasn't very popular as mobile gaming wasn't very popular at the time. However, it was the first of its kind, which will see it grow in popularity in later generations. There are 4 things that the 7th generation of gaming is particularly known for. HD graphics and extreme realism. A massive push for online gaming. Downloadable games and mobile gaming. And motion gaming. Firstly, let's talk about the introduction of HD graphics. The Xbox 360 was released in 2005 and was the first console release that offered HD graphics. HD graphics were of better quality, clearer, smoother, and overall just better looking than anything that had been seen previously. The PlayStation 3 followed soon after in 2006 and offered similar specs to the Xbox 360, although it was slightly more powerful and boasted a Blu-ray drive which allowed it to read Blu-ray discs, which was significantly larger than DVDs in terms of storage. Thanks to the power of these two consoles, developers were able to make games look very realistic and as close as possible to real life. Games that particularly show off this realism are Metal Gear Solid 4, Uncharted, and Heavy Rain. One game to particularly known for realism is Rockstar's L.A. Noire. L.A. Noire features depth analysis' newly developed technology for the film and video game industries called motion scanning that utilises 32 cameras to record an actor's every wince, swallow and blink, which is then transferred to in-game animation.
I need you guys to try and recover the gat.
You want us to look anywhere in particular?
Give it your best shot, guys. The dead guy's a lowlife. I'm not expecting any miracles here.
And if we recover the weapon...
This game also incorporates real actors in the game rather than just their voices. This is the closest the game has ever come to a film. Games were generally just becoming more like film. Developers no longer cared much about censorship in terms of swearing, violence, and sex or nudity. In fact, a lot of games were fueled by this. Not only did HD graphics make some games look more realistic, but they also improved the look of games that used more cartoony styled graphics. Video games in this generation also try to take a much more artistic approach and create stories, worlds, and unique experiences that can only be seen in the video game industry. These games tend to be rather niche, but often acquire cult followings. Some examples of games that take this approach are El Shaddai, and Catherine. This generation saw a massive push in online gaming where so many games were incorporating it in some way. The Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 both had online services that boasted millions of active users. A lot of the success of online gaming is due to popular games like the Call of Duty franchise, the Halo franchise, and the Gears of War franchise. Most of online gaming is seen in the shooter, sports or racing genre of games, but it has branched off into many other genres. In fact, some franchises that were single player only decided to incorporate versus multiplayer, such as Assassin's Creed and Uncharted. This can be dangerous as a lot of franchises have started to shift away from their single player roots, like Shadowrun. And some games are just getting tacked on online multiplayer because developers are worried that games will not sell without it, due to the type of gamers these days. Due to the massive success of the iPod and iPad, mobile gaming has become a dominant part of the market. Many people tend to avoid buying consoles altogether because they can just buy an iPad and download games much cheaper, quicker, and have it all stored on the iPad itself. Downloadable games also become a large part of gaming during this generation thanks to the Xbox Live Arcade, the PlayStation Network, and the WiiWare. Downloadable and mobile games are generally created by smaller, less known independent companies, and are released much more frequently than retail games. This is a strength because it can lead to massive independent hits such as Angry Birds and Castle Crashers. However, it is also a weakness. Like with the Atari 2600, it can also lead to an abundance of games of low quality, or that just don't sell at all. A lot of the most creative games that are released that are very unique and that sometimes cross genres are released as downloadable games. This is because it is much less of a financial risk to release downloadable games, and so independent companies can take more risks with games. Some examples of this are Lost Winds on WiiWare and Journey on PlayStation Network. The last thing that has really shown an increase in this generation is motion gaming. This is where the player is required to do more than just press buttons to play games. The release of the Nintendo Wii in 2006 was the first major step into motion gaming. Unlike the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, the Wii did not have HD graphics. Instead, its major selling point was the controller, which was shaped like a remote. You operated it by tilting it, waving it, pointing it at the screen, and performing other motions. In 2010, Microsoft improved on motion gaming with the release of the Kinect. In a nutshell, Kinect was a camera that could detect your body's movement in order to play games. The Kinect attempted to get rid of the controller and make the player themselves the controller. Sony also tried to capitalise on motion gaming with the release of the PlayStation Move, although I did not see the same level of success as either the Wii or the Kinect. Motion gaming in particular made the divide between hardcore gamers and casual gamers much more apparent. A lot of people owned Wiis and Kinects just to play fitness games or party games. The fact that the Wii, a less powerful console, outsold both its competitors shows that motion gaming and innovation is more important to the masses than HD graphics. In terms of handheld gaming in this generation, the best-selling handheld of all time was released, the Nintendo DS. The DS was the first handheld to fully embrace 3D graphics. But the most innovative thing about the DS was its dual screens, the bottom of which was a touch screen. This allowed for many unique experiences to be created for the Nintendo DS, and was a very big influence as most handheld consoles after this point used touchscreen technology. Sony also released the PlayStation Portable, also known as the PSP. The PSP was the first handheld to use discs as its media format. It used small discs known as UMDs. The PSP focused heavily on graphics and was comparable to the PS2 in terms of graphical and sound capabilities. It was also like the PS2 in that it focused heavily on being a multimedia device and was advertised as such. As well as play games, it could play music, play video, view photos and other things. The PSP was also the first handheld to feature an analog stick. Sony's PSP put up a good fight against the Nintendo DS and has been one of the only valid competitors that Nintendo has had in terms of handheld gaming. Although only just recently starting, this generation has seen a lot of innovation already, so far mainly in terms of handheld gaming. The first handheld console released was Nintendo's 3DS. It included an auto-stereoscopic screen which allowed the projection of 3D images without the use of glasses. This was not only a first for the video game industry, but was a first for electronic entertainment in general. The 3DS also has a built-in gyro sensor for motion controls and augmented reality technology. Earlier this year, Sony released the Sony PlayStation Vita. The PlayStation Vita had many never-before-seen features. These included dual analog sticks on a handheld console, a front touchscreen and a rear touchpad, and HD graphics on a handheld. So far, all that has been shown off in terms of new consoles being released this generation is Nintendo's Wii U, which is set for release November 30th in Europe. The Wii U's most unique feature is the controller that features a 6.2-inch HD screen built onto it. This is a built-in touchscreen which can either supplement or replicate the gameplay shown on the main display, and can function as a standalone screen without the use of a television screen. Since we're coming to our limit in terms of graphical capability, companies have to think of new innovative ideas in order to sell their consoles, which has been shown with the few consoles released already. However, we have yet to see of what Microsoft and Sony are going to offer in their 8th generation. So to sum up, hopefully this video has shown you just how much the video game industry has changed since its beginnings in the early 1970s. We've come so far in so little time, and I don't believe we're going to see as much changes in the video game industry in the next 30 to 40 years as we've seen in the previous 30 to 40 years. So what do I believe was the biggest turning point in the video games industry? Personally, I believe it was the transition between the 4th and 5th generation. The leap into the 3rd dimension and the improvement of graphics, sound, and just the overall way that games were made showed the amount of progress, and since then it has just been about tweaking and fine-tuning video games. Also, the 5th generation was when video games became fully embraced as a mainstream industry. So I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.